called America when he got to where he was going. He noted that what we know about Columbus in our folk culture, and what my daughter has been taught in elementary school in Ames, really comes from Washington Irving's account of Christopher Columbus, which he wrote not so much as a historian, but more as a fiction writer, or a biographer who embellished the details to serve his interests. Mr. Sale also talked about some of the consequences of these myths about Columbus, and he named two in particular. One is that Americans have often had the idea that taking over the world was something that they were entitled to do, and he mentioned that it's somehow in the soul of Europe to be expansionist in this way, perhaps in a way that no other culture or civilization has been, and the economic and political structures of Europe reached out and colonized not only this continent but others as a result of not Columbus himself, but of the set of ideas that Columbus represented. This resulted, too, in a holocaust of people and of nature, with many people, 97%, I think he said, of all Native Americans wiped out primarily by disease organisms, along with many flora and fauna native to this continent. And he suggested that we begin a new myth, and some of the components of that myth he suggested would be that we give up thinking of nature as something to be exploited and colonized by us, and recover native and indigenous understandings of nature that are appropriate to this continent, where we think of nature more organically, think of distributing its resources more fairly and justly, and less acquisitively, being interested more in taking care of the country and the land and each other than accumulating riches. The second lecture, conceptually, although it was first temporally yesterday, is by Professor Peter Paris from Princeton Theological Seminary. Peter, would you stand? Thank you. And Professor Paris told us that African Americans will not be celebrating the quincentenary of Columbus's coming because it has that celebration perpetuates a myth of greed and selfishness, despoliation of natural resources, all legitimized by the Spanish crown and the Roman Church. He suggested that African American Christianity is unique in a way, and a unique resource for trying to evolve a new myth of our origins, in that it has a history of non-racist, all-inclusive morality. He said it's unique in this respect, and noted that even the Christian abolitionist denominations, which fought against slavery, explicitly denied, that they believed in the equality of all races. So he suggested that African American Christianity is, again, a resource for reconstructing a new myth of origins. And he made one suggestion for how to kill the old Columbus myth, and that is through willful neglect. And he urged us to make every effort to prepare the nation for a new myth and the death of the old one. We continue today by looking at the effect of the Columbus myth on Native Americans in this session, and later this afternoon at 3:30 in this room, the myth's effect on Latin Americans. That lecture will be given by Professor Luis Rivera Pagan. Luis, I saw you walk in. Here he is. Thank you. And then tonight at 8 p.m., our four speakers are going to gather and reflect in common in the sunroom on the effect of the Columbus myth on European Americans, Americans of European descent, which, as I look quickly around the room, is most of us here. So I would urge you to come to that session, and I would also tantalize you by saying I've asked the speakers to think of some heroes or heroines that might constitute a new myth that I can tell my daughter to replace the myth of Columbus. Now, to introduce this speaker session, I want to turn the podium over to one of my advisees and a religious studies major. I would note that some of the brightest students in the university are in the religious studies major. We hope that will continue a long time. Many of them in this room, and one of them, Heather Carver.
Several months ago, the Religious Ethics Conference Committee got together and we were looking for a speaker for this topic. We were concerned not only with getting someone who could give us a Native American perspective, but someone who had a historical background. And so we were delighted when Clara Sue Kidwell agreed to come out and enjoy some Iowa weather and speak at our conference. Having received both a master's and a doctorate in history of science from the University of Oklahoma, Ms. Kidwell has held several teaching positions and is currently an associate professor in the Native American Studies program at the University of California, Berkeley. She is a member of several Native American and historical societies, most currently holding the position of president of the American Society for Ethnohistory. Mrs. Kidwell's most recent published works include Science and Ethnoscience, Native American Worldviews as a Factor in the Development of Native Technologies, in the book Environmental History, Critical Issues and Comparative Perspectives, Native Knowledge in the Americas, in the publication Osiris, and the Choctaw Struggle for the Land and Identity in the Mississippi, 1830 to 1918, in the book After Removal, the Choctaw in Mississippi. Would you please join me in welcoming Clara Sue Kidwell.
I grew up in Oklahoma, and after having spent a number of years out in California, I'd have to say that all that sunshine gets positively boring sometimes. One of the things about being third on the list in a conference like this is you get a chance to reflect on what the people before you have said and to try to build on the themes that they have begun to develop. And after listening to Dr. Paris and Mr. Sale, I have oriented this talk around a new title, and that is Myth and Counter-Myth. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. This little ditty is probably irrevocably imprinted on the minds of most grade school students. I think I probably heard it in the second grade. It is a statement of fact. Columbus sailed across what was then the ocean sea in 1492, and we have historical records of that. It is a fact, however, and in this sort of little fanciful presentation in the little couplet, is indeed the beginning of a very powerful myth, the myth of the Columbian discovery of the New World. But, as we heard last night from Mr. Sale, I think he disabused us very effectively of the idea that Columbus discovered the New World. I was interested to note, though, that he turned the discovery over to the Native Americans. And this raises some problems from a Native American perspective. Anthropologists and archaeologists tell us about the Bering Straits theory, the great land bridge between Asia and the New World, North America, over which Indians supposedly crossed to discover this continent. Or, as a friend of mine says, the reason that Indians are in North America today instead of still being in Asia is simply because they couldn't keep their bearings straight. Vine Deloria says, look at which way the footprints went. Many Native American traditions, myths in their own right, tell about an origin in this continent. Let me use the Navajo story as an example. The Navajo, in a reservation which now encompasses a good deal of northern Arizona and parts of Colorado and Utah, tell about their emergence into that land from worlds below. This is, depending on whose story, and there are several versions of this story, the fourth or the fifth world of the Navajo. They began their lives in the lower worlds where their deities lived and created things, and each world as they came up, the lower world was destroyed and they moved into a new world. In the very elaborate versions of this origin tradition, there is the association of colors. The first world is dark, the next world is, the color sequences vary, but blue, the next world may be red, the next world yellow, and finally into this world, white, which encompasses all colors. It is also a progression from a world where there is little in the way of material surroundings to a world that is now bounded by 4 sacred mountains in Colorado and in Arizona. One set of those mountains, the San Francisco Peaks outside Flagstaff, Arizona, if you've ever traveled across I-40. But the interesting thing is that this origin story for the Navajo is their history. This is how they came to be where they were. Anthropologists and archaeologists trace the origins of the Navajo from central Alaska. They do this on the basis of language. The Athabascan language stock is common both to Athabascan-speaking natives in the interior of Alaska and to the Navajo and their neighbors, the Apache, in the Southwest today. Using a scientific technique called glottochronology, which I won't try to explain, but which deals with the divergence of languages over time as they are spoken, the linguists place the divergence of the Navajo from, or the departure of the Navajo from central Alaska at about 800 AD, and their migration down the slopes of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains or through the Great Plains, occupying about 700 years until they finally appeared in the Southwest in the area around between the conjunctions of the San Juan and the Rio Grande River, or the Colorado River, in about 1450 AD. Here we have 2 stories about the origins of the Navajo, one based on a kind of scientific investigation, the other based upon the Navajo's own tradition of how they came to be where they were. One can look at these as kind of analogous stories, though, if you look at the sense of emergence from a cold, dark underworld from below into a land of light and warmth, with a kind of parallel of emergence from the central part of Alaska into the warm, bright sunshine of eastern New Mexico or western New Mexico. I use this story to point up the ways in which different people create their senses of reality, the ways in which they explain themselves and their origins and essentially their histories. These 2 constructs together bring up a larger sense of what I have come to call a world view. Now, a worldview, and this is primarily an anthropological term, is essentially the way that people look out and see the world around them. And I have devised these 2 constructs of worldview, which I would characterize on the one hand as the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Western European scientific worldview of contemporary society, and the American Indian world view. And I would characterize that with an S on the end of the views, because one thing that is a tendency to mythologize American Indians in contemporary society is to hold up this kind of essentialized construct of Indianness and to ignore the vast diversity of Indian people who were here in the New World at the time that Columbus bumped into it. This diversity, 2,000, perhaps as many as 2,000 mutually unintelligible languages, tribal groups adapting to terrains all the way from central Alaska, from the coast of the Arctic Ocean down to Tierra del Fuego, a tremendous variety of environmental adaptations and different cultural manifestations and world views. But nevertheless, I think there are some commonalities among those people who were here in the New World that I can sort of fit into this worldview construct. Let me set this up with another little story about a story that I think illuminates some of the basic differences between these two world views. An anthropologist named A. Irving Hollowell was working with the people, the Saulteaux or Chippewa Indians around the Barrens River region in Canada in the late 1930s. And he asked this Chippewa man a question. Are all the rocks that we see around us alive? Well, what Hollowell was looking for as an anthropologist was a linguistic categorization of animate and inanimate endings on words in the Ojibwe language. He had noticed that some terms for rocks and stones and certain kinds of shells had animate endings. So Hollowell asks his question, are all the rocks we see around us alive? And the Chippewa man thought about it for a minute, and finally he said, no, but some are. What characterizes those some? Well, if Hollowell was looking for categories, laws that govern the structure of the language, what the Chippewa man found most important was that some rocks are alive. He was interested in what was unusual, rocks that acted in different ways. And when pressed to explain how rocks could possibly be alive, he told stories about how they had been seen to speak, how they sometimes moved of their own accord. How many of you have ever been walking down a path and in a forest someplace or on a hillside, and all of a sudden some dumb little rock comes bouncing down the hillside and hits you on the head? Some rocks can move of their own accord, and not just because somebody's dislodged them from above. And this is a very strong belief in certain religious rituals of the Chippewa people, those who practice the traditional religion. This notion of lawful or law-driven, let's call it, behavior, on the one hand, is very much, I think, a characteristic of this Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Western European scientific worldview that I have constructed on the one hand, and the interest in the sum, the powers, the animateness, the will and volition of the forces of the natural world, those rocks that can move, is characteristic of the Native American or American Indian worldview on the other. Let me briefly sketch out some of the elements that I see in this Western worldview. Let me use that as a kind of shorthand. That from the Greeks, the whole tradition of scientific inquiry begins with the notion of rationalism, Aristotle and logic, with the notion of skepticism, that we do not necessarily trust what our eyes and senses tell us. From the Romans, we get a sense of hierarchy, of empire building, of building of structures that mirror the sort of magnificence of the power of the Roman Empire. From the Judaic tradition, we get the notion of monotheism, the notion of a chosen people, and I think very strongly the notion of law, the laws of God. From the Christian tradition, we get a sense of the otherworldliness that leads us to look beyond this world and into some future world. I think we also get a distinctively linear sense of time in that Christian tradition, progress towards some given end. From the Western aspect, I think we get a kind of I hate to do this. We create dichotomies in the world between us and them, the Orient and the Occident, East and West, the strange and exotic other, and us. And from Europe, I think we get distinctly the sense of nationalism, the sort of codifying of national identities. People become Huns, and people become Greeks, and people become Turks, and people become any of a variety of sort of nationally identified nations. From the scientific worldview, we get that peculiar construct, and I think this follows on some of the things Mr. Sale was saying about last night, this peculiar construct that the world is somehow a materialist, real thing out there, subject to certain natural laws, and that human beings, through rational inquiry, are able to determine what those laws are. There are certain key elements of this scientific construct: that one observes nature, that one draws hypotheses about nature, and this is where we get into the whole idea of a world view, how you develop those hypotheses, what are your underlying premises about the world. Then, having determined a hypothesis, one experiments, one tests, sets up circumstances, changes conditions, tries to see what the outcome of an event is going to be. And in order to assure that that event is always going to react in the same way, one must replicate, i.e., you have to do the experiment and somebody else has to be able to do the experiment and get the same results. Now this, in a very concise, very abstract, and very, I must admit, idealized kind of notion, represents, I think, the scientific aspect of this Western world view. That materializing, or as Kirkpatrick Sale used the term last night, the de-godding of nature, which reduces it to, as I say, law-driven material entity. An entity without any will or volition of its own. The scientist would question the Ojibwe man's notions, if not his sanity, when he maintains that rocks actually can move, that rocks have power, that they do things on their own. And yet for the Chippewa man, that is the essence of nature. Its very ability to move and to change and to do things on its own. And yet it's this driving Western world view which has created the myth of the American Indian and put it to its own use. And it is the destructive force of that myth that I think we are here in this conference to try to address and to try to counter. One of the first myths that we come across from this Western world view is that Native Americans were not people who had any sort of idea of science, but rather who were totally at the control of their environments, at the mercy of their environments. That they had to pray to it, propitiate it, depend upon it, hope for the best, as it were, in their attempts to survive in their respective environments. But let us consider what was going on 1,500 years ago, and I'll use that same construct that Kirkpatrick Sale used last night. Consider that in, probably October of 1492, Columbus was standing on the deck of the Santa Maria with his astrolabes and his compasses and his sextants, and he was measuring his position on the earth relative to the stars in the sky. We know that Columbus had access to various kinds of navigational instruments and also, I think, a certain amount of pure blind luck in there. But he was using knowledge that was based on systematic observations of the natural environment. Even the knowledge that the world was round, which was widespread at the time, came from observing natural phenomenon, and that's perfectly much a part of the scientific enterprise. At about the same time, maybe not exactly on October the 11th, 1492, because I don't think they start doing it that early now, a Hopi man in northern Alaska, Arizona, on one of the three Hopi mesas, maybe Old Arribe, outside Old Arribe on Third Mesa, walked over to a rise of land not too far from his village. It was before dawn, but the sky was beginning to lighten. He seated himself at the top of that rise, and he proceeded to watch for the point where the sun rose on the horizon. He had been doing this for several days, and he carefully charted the path of the sun as each morning it rose at a slightly different point. Hopi people are still doing this. Hopi men still go out to watch the sun before, in about a month's period before the winter solstice. An article on archaeoastronomy that I read points out that now one of the key markers on the horizon, usually it's the tops of mounds or of hills or river valleys or things, notches in the horizon. Now one of them is the rooftop of the Hopi Motel and Cultural Center at Second Mesa, but nevertheless the process is the same. Systematically observing the point on the horizon at which the sun rises. This is in order to both predict and note the solstice. How many of you can explain scientifically why we have solstices? How many of you know what a solstice is? Okay. But the Hopi story about solstices says that the sun is a being, and he travels across the sky. And in the summer, he goes to his northernmost house, and in the winter, he goes to his southernmost house. And at each point, he rests for a few days before he begins to go back across the sky to begin his journey to his other home. It's this yearly alternation between the northern and southern houses that accounts for the winter and the summer solstice, and also, of course, for the turning of the seasons, which for the Hopi people, since they are agriculturalists, is an essential part of their life. The timing of the solstice is critical for the Hopi because it marks the Soyal ceremony. Soyal is an 8-day ceremony. It starts with preparations in the villages. People pray. Men go into kivas to perform certain rituals, to sing. And the Soyal ceremony is essential to the Hopi lifestyle because it is what makes the sun turn in his path. It gives the sun the energy that he needs to leave his southern house and begin his journey back across the sky to his northern house. In other words, the Hopi are an integral part of this whole process. They are not simply subject to the laws of nature, to the unchanging variety of the seasons, to the unending cycles of the natural environment. They are part of what makes it happen. Again, this is a dramatically different attitude than the astronomer who might observe the tilt of the sun or the Earth on its axis in regard to the plane of the sun's rotation, etc., etc. Columbus watched the stars systematically. He observed. He benefited from observations that other people had made. The Hopi man knows where the points are along the horizon, certainly. It is his job to watch to make sure that that the sun sets where it's supposed to. He is also a part of the process. A crucial difference here between what the Hopi person is doing, it has some aspects of science in that systematic observation, in the ability to predict the outcome of events. Where Native people, I think, differed from this whole strain of intellectual inquiry in the Western tradition is in the notion of experiment. The Western scientist, confronted with the assertion that the soil is necessary to make the sun turn in its path, would say, oh, well, let's test that. Let's not do the soil and see whether the sun continues. The Hopi person wouldn't dare do that. There is far too much at stake. There is the continuation of the whole Hopi world. Because if the sun doesn't turn, the seasons don't change, the crops don't grow, and the Hopi as a culture, as a people, will die. This notion of Indians not having science is true if you define science within that Western construct that I have mentioned. But if you define it in some of its very basic elements of observation and prediction, Indian people were perfectly capable of doing that and of explaining in their own terms the reasons why they did it. Modern archaeologists cannot always explain the reasons why Indian people did some of these things. The medicine wheel on the sides of the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming is a good example. This is a circle of stones about 50 feet in diameter. It's laid out on a bluff that sort of juts out of the side of the Bighorn Mountains. It has 28 spokes that go out from in a circular pattern from the stone cairn. So this is really like a wheel. There are 5 stone cairns around the edges of this thing. And if you stand at one of these, sight across the central cairn to the far one, looking out over the horizon, on June the 21st, you see the sunrise. This is an observational marker. Those of you who might be familiar with Stonehenge may be aware of this kind of construct of noting the points of the solstice and marking them. But the interesting thing is that for the medicine wheel, if you line up certain other spokes with these cairns, there are alignments where you can cite the rising of certain key bright stars above the horizon just before dawn. And these risings presage the solstice itself by several weeks. Again, a form of predicting what is going to happen on the 21st. The bright stars Rigel and Aldebaran, some of you Star Trekkies may recognize those names, are key points in this whole system. But obviously marking these means that people are aware, very much aware, of the processes of the environment. They are able to record it. They are able to predict and to control, in that regard, the outcome of what is going to happen. Agriculture certainly is one of the great human intellectual achievements. It marks a change. I would characterize it as marking a change in the sense of dependency of plants and human beings, a different relationship of plants and human beings. Let us go back to the Hopi, who as dry farmers do not irrigate and who depend on the underlying ground moisture in a very arid environment. They had adapted corn seeds by selection to put down a very long central root. They planted their corn with digging sticks. They poked it about a foot down into the ground. They then covered the seed. The root went down, say, another foot, at least foot and a half, to tap underground moisture. And because the seed was so far in the ground, it grows along, what do you call when the seed puts up the first shoot before the little leaves set? There's a technical name for it. Any ag majors? No. Well, one of those things, anyway, is adapted to come a long way up before it sets those first 2 seeds. And this is a matter of selection. The Hopi also selected corn for different colors, which had sacred and ceremonial significance. They were able then to adapt to a very harsh and rigorous environment. The whole domestication of corn, and God knows what would Iowa be without corn, is a matter of, a conscious, as I say, altering the relationship. Domestication of plants generally means that when people go out to gather wild plants scatter their seeds readily, wind, animals, such, so that the seed is dispersed and will grow. People who want to gather those seeds for their own food use will select plants where the seeds are most closely contained and not so easily scattered. Makes it easier to gather them, right? And by selecting for those plants, the human being encourages the growth of those who contain the seeds most closely, but if the plants themselves lose the capacity to scatter their own seeds, then human beings have to intervene to scatter the seeds in order to cause the plants to grow. And so looking at variations in seeds is one way to talk about domestication. It is also a relationship between human beings and plants. There's some wonderful origin stories about corn that come to us from agricultural tribes throughout North America. There's one, and I don't remember which tribe, but it's one of the tribes that was originally here in Iowa, about the woman who is feeding her family with corn. This is the Indian story about the origin of corn. This is their myth, as it were. A woman who was feeding her family with this wonderful new food, but she wouldn't tell them where she was getting it. So finally one day, two of her sons followed her, and they discovered that she was out back behind the little house, and she was rubbing skin off parts of her body, and it fell off in little kernels, and she gathered them up, and she then cooked them for her family. Her sons were appalled. She was practicing witchcraft or doing really weird things, and when they discovered her, she discovered that they knew, and she said, "Now you know the secret. You must kill me." So the sons killed the mother, and they drag her body around the fields, and then they bury it. And the next year, from that spot, the corn plants begin to grow. Now this myth explains, not necessarily in what we call scientific terms, but explains a tremendously complex and sophisticated association of life and death and women and land and fertility and growth. Corn plants have to die for new corn plants to come forth. Seasons change. Plants come and go. Life goes on. It is a wonderful metaphor, not, as I say, particularly scientific, but another way of understanding the very nature of the physical world and establishing a relationship with it. The notion that Indians did not have science, that they were totally at the mercy of their environments, belies this incredible richness of Indians' own mythic traditions about the origins of things, and most importantly, how they relate to those particular things. It is really this richness of understanding that constitutes a Native American worldview on the one hand, and the Western worldview that sees Indians through its own particular, let's call it, lens. This notion of worldview then explains also how Europeans built their particular myths about Indians. Most of it really does come through the lens of Christianity. The notion of the Indians who Columbus first encountered and who Bartolomé de las Casas attempted to protect, the attitudes came very much from the Aristotelian idea of natural slavery. Aristotle, our good old Greek friend back there, propounded that there were distinguishing categories of human beings. Some were meant to be slaves, some were meant to be masters. When Europeans encountered the Indian, they saw people who were strange, different, spoke different languages, did things in different ways. And they categorized them, some of the intellectuals of the time, as slaves. And they justified the enslavement of Indians in the mines, the silver mines of Potosi, or as slave labor on the encomienda system, the control of land that the Spaniards set up. This notion of natural slavery was debated. Las Casas and Sepulveda, another missionary or another priest, in 1550, were debating the very notion: were Indians human beings? Could they even be saved? Did they have souls? What were these creatures? Here, the Western European view is attempting to fit Indians into its own categories, with disastrous results for native populations that were enslaved and suffered death and disease in the mines that the Spaniards set up to extract the wealth of the New World. Another interesting myth in American history is that very myth of the wilderness. Again, a very Christian notion. Wilderness in the Christian notion is that which is outside the organized social structure and is unbounded by the will of God or challenges the will of God. Think of all the notions of wilderness in the Bible. Christ goes out into the wilderness to fast and pray for 40 days. God leads the children of Israel out of the wilderness. That wilderness had to be brought under control in the Christian mind. When in Puritan New England, the Europeans, the English colonists, first encountered the Indians lived in the wilderness. They were part of it. They were part of a whole mindset that European-based Christianity saw as threatening, as unlawful, not subject to the laws of God, having its own will, the willfulness of Indians. And so they had to reduce them. They had to Christianize them. They had to missionize them, put them into villages, try to change their lifestyles. This disease was one aspect of this when the John Winthrop, for instance, looked out of, I don't know where he looked out from exactly, but over the colony, Plymouth, and in 1637 the Indians had been largely decimated by a smallpox epidemic. Winthrop says, and I paraphrase his words, that God had cleared the forests of the Indians so that it could be more productively used by the, quote, sons of Adam. We get that biblical notion of Cain and Abel. No, Cain, the hunter, the wild man; Abel, the husbandman, the farmer, the fruits of whose labor are pleasing to God. This juxtaposition of savagery and wilderness and civilization and farming is one that prevails throughout the history of Indian-white relations and federal Indian policy, and I cannot possibly explicate all of that in the little bit of remaining time that I have. But it is a very profound sort of myth that pervades the lives of Indian people. One of my favorite myths in Indian history is Pocahontas. You've all heard of Pocahontas. There's the story about how Pocahontas, John Smith, English adventurer, founder of Jamestown Colony, is brought before Powhatan, the head of the Indian Confederacy in the area, Chesapeake Bay area. And the Indians feast him and, greet him. And then they bring out these two big rocks, lay John Smith down, and several Indian men come out with big clubs to smash John Smith's head. And Pocahontas, this comely young girl, leaps up, throws herself on John Smith, seizes his head in her arms, and saves his life. What is the usual reading of this story? Well, the Indians, Pocahontas was overcome by passion. She helped John Smith. She thereby saved the colony out of love of a white man. Was Pocahontas really overcome with passion for John Smith? Did she really develop a crush on him? Highly unlikely. Was she being compassionate? We know that the coastal Algonquian people tortured the members of enemy tribes and Europeans viciously, and was part of a whole cultural construct. What I think Pocahontas was doing was adopting John Smith. It is in the power of women in matrilineal societies, which the Eastern Algonquian tribes largely were, to take war captives into the tribe to replace men who have been lost. They are often the ones who determine tribal membership. Here we have John Smith, the captive. Here we have Pocahontas, daughter of a chief, young, probably nubile, just emerging into womanhood. We have this gathering of high prestigious people, including several women who were reported. Pocahontas is sort of trying out her power here. We have a captive, we've got power, we'll adopt him. And if you follow the story through, she continues to take aid to the Jamestown colony. She takes food. She continues to be in contact with John Smith throughout the rest of his stay. He's the one who picked up and left her. Went back to England in